A man holds a bowling ball attached to a string that is mounted to a hook attached to the ceiling. He lets go of the bowling ball and waits for it to return. As the bowling ball comes back towards him, he doesn't flinch because the law of conservation of energy tells him that the ball will never hit him. The law of conservation of energy states that unless work is done on or by a system, its total mechanical energy does not change. When the bowling ball swings back and forth, the rope rubs against the hook and does work against friction, and that explains why the bowling ball does not return to its original position.
Зуб там даже мешка цемента по весу нету.
What? Ебать его конем!
Since the girl in this video goes so much higher than the initial position where the men began, does that mean she has more potential energy than they did? The law of conservation of energy tells us that the girl could never have more potential energy than the men. As you learned in a previous lesson, potential energy is determined by height and mass. The men have more mass, and that contributes to their potential energy. When the men jump from the platform, their potential energy turns to kinetic energy, which provided the energy to launch the girl. The total energy before this event equals the total energy after. This presentation will focus on the energy changes that occur when work is not done on or by a system. When work is not done on or by a system, the total mechanical energy of the system does not change. Mechanical energy is the sum of the kinetic and potential energies of a system. Another way to state the law of conservation of energy is that energy cannot be created or destroyed, it just changes forms. Let's look at a simple example. A ball with a potential energy of 100 joules and a kinetic energy of 0 is dropped. Since it falls without friction, it does no work, so its total energy will remain the same. At the halfway point, 10 meters, the potential energy is half its original amount, so it's 50 joules. Since the total energy does not change, the kinetic energy will be 50 joules as well. When the potential energy of the ball is 20 joules, what's the object's kinetic energy? Since the object falls without friction, the total energy will be conserved. The kinetic energy will be 80 joules. Just before the ball hits the ground, the height is 0, so the potential energy also equals 0. At this point, all the object's energy is kinetic. Once the ball hits the ground, the work is done on it by the floor, and its energy is no longer 100 joules. Since energy is conserved, as the object falls, the potential energy that it loses always equals the kinetic energy that it gains. As a ball rolls down a ramp without friction, its potential energy turns into kinetic energy. When it reaches the bottom, all the potential energy turns into kinetic energy. As the ball rolls up the hill, the kinetic energy turns back into potential. The ball only stops rolling up the hill when all its kinetic energy completely turns back into potential energy. When the ball reaches its original height, it returns to its original potential energy. A 3-kilogram ball at rest is released and rolls down a hill. Let's look at the PE and the KE changes as the ball moves from A to G. To make it easy to calculate potential energy, let's make the acceleration due to gravity 10 meters per second squared instead of 9.8. Since there is no friction in this example, the total energy of the ball will not change. What is the potential energy of the ball at A? Since the potential energy is mgh, the potential energy is 90 joules. Since we are told that the object starts at rest, we know that the kinetic energy is 0 and the total mechanical energy is 90 joules. What is the potential and kinetic energy at B? PE equals mgh. Since the potential energy is 30 joules, the kinetic energy has to be 60 joules since the total mechanical energy does not change. When the ball reaches point C, its height equals 0 and the potential energy does too. What is the kinetic energy at this point? Since the total energy doesn't change, the kinetic energy equals 90 joules. All the potential energy is now converted to kinetic energy. The potential energy at point E will also be 0 joules, so the kinetic energy will also be 90 joules. What is the potential and kinetic energy at D? Since the height is 1 meter, the potential energy is 30 joules. Since the total energy doesn't change, the kinetic energy is 60 joules. The height at F is also 1 meter, so the potential energy is 30 joules, and the kinetic energy is 60 joules there as well. The ball will have a potential energy of 90 joules at G. All the ball's kinetic energy has turned into potential energy, and it returns to the height where it began. In this lesson, you learned that when no work is done on or by a system, its total mechanical energy remains the same. The total mechanical energy is the sum of the kinetic and potential energy. When an object loses potential energy, it gains kinetic energy and vice versa. This is the end of my presentation on the law of conservation of energy.